Stan Jabalisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1 GV Whiskey 1, Good Vibrations. As I described in another video about W1AW, I graduated college in the spring of 1977, and now I realize, good grief, that was 42 years ago. And I took a job at W1AW in the wilds of Connecticut. When I moved out there, I moved into a house with two other fellow ARRL staffers on a couple of acres of land with a 90-foot tower and a tri-bander on top, or anyway, beam antennas on the top, and 40-meter dipole, 80-meter dipole. There was no antenna for 160 meters, regrettably, and I never put one up. But I moved out there, and we had our stations, all three of us, in the basement of that suburban house. The rent, when I think of it today, was remarkably low, considering the location of the property and the size of the land. It was somewhere on the order of $1,000 or $1,200 a month for that land, and in those times, that was low, especially in a prestigious community such as Farmington, Connecticut. But anyway, my radio, my rig, personal rig, was a Drake R4A receiver, a Drake T4X transmitter, and a Drake L4B, Lima 4 Bravo, linear amplifier. At that time, the maximum legal limit was 1,000 watts plate power input on CW and 2,000 watts peak envelope power on single sideband. Well, I did all CW, and my keyer was a Hallicrafters TO keyer. Many of you may remember that. All of this equipment was vacuum tube equipment. Of course, that was 42 years ago. It worked great, and if I didn't operate W1AW after hours during my weird shift there, I oftentimes came home. I usually went to bed, but I also oftentimes came home and operated some at my own station. And of course, on rainy days or winter days, I operated during the weekdays on that station on 20, 15, 10, and worked a lot of DX. I also did a lot of other things besides radio hamming. Particularly, I was a member of the New Britain YMCA. New Britain was considered a kind of a rough town, but I found it to be just fine. Nobody ever bothered me there, and their YMCA had a great swimming pool with warm water, and I enjoyed it very much. It was a very, very interesting lifestyle. Eventually, I moved out of that house into an apartment on the third floor of a big house in West Hartford, Connecticut. When I transferred from the communications department, W1AW, to the technical department and served as an editorial assistant or technical editor or something like that during much of 1978 and 1979 under Jerry Hall, Kilo 1 Tango Delta, the head of the technical department. And I wrote some articles for QST, and in that time frame you will see a few articles by me in QST. If you have issues of the early 1979, I think probably May or June 1979 QST. The one article that I wrote that I thought was the best was called "What Does Your SWR Cost You?" It outlined a lot of misconceptions about what standing wave ratio actually means and what it actually does in antenna systems, the effects that it has, how much detrimental effect does it really have, etc. And then I believe it was in May of 1979, I decided, after a couple of rough winters up there, which I called the Winter of Storms, when we had one of those classic snowbound New England winters, where it snowed until it was 4 feet deep on the ground, and some of these bomb cyclones, they call them, developed off of the coast and moved in. And then the second winter was the one I spent in West Hartford, and I called that one the Winter of Viruses, because as I recall, I got very bad cases of colds and flu 5 times during that winter. But I also operated some 10-meter DX with 3 watts, courtesy of a trimmed down CB radio antenna, Citizens Band radio antenna, scaled down to 28 megahertz, 3 watts on the roof of that apartment building. My landlord was very gracious in allowing me to put up such a monstrosity. And then in May of '79, when I moved to Miami, Florida, I just left that thing up there. And he never got after me. He even refunded my security deposit. A really great guy. He had a little trouble with the heating system in that house, as I recall, but I managed to convince him to turn the heat up. It was very hard to regulate the temperature in that old house. In West Hartford, Connecticut, that was one of the more prestigious suburbs of Hartford, as well as Farmington. In May of 1979, all of my ARRL association, as far as being a member of their staff, ended. I wanted to go south, and I went south, and for the next probably 20 years or 30 years, I lived in various places in the southern United States, various parts of Florida. I lived in California. I lived in Hawaii. I lived in Nevada, in Carson City, Nevada, and I just sort of ran around, and I guess there's a song, I have been a loner, I have walked alone, hiked 100 highways, never found a home, until eventually I moved out here to the Black Holes of Dakota Territory, United States of Amateur Radio, set up a station here, as I've described in many other videos, and it's all recent history from there right up until this moment, where I still live in that house in the town of Lead, South Dakota. But I have operated ham radio from all different kinds of places, and I also went through about a 15 or 20 year period when I didn't have a station and didn't do ham radio at all. But the home for Wayward hams is the place where I had the best station of all the stations I've ever had at my home residence. And I recall with some fondness working from the basement of that house that has the smell that only basements of suburban houses in the northern United States can have, that sort of musty and yet friendly smell, as my Drake L4B loafed along at 1 kilowatt DC plate power input, and worked DX all over the world. Oh well, just some stories I thought you might like to hear. Or not, as the case may be. So here we are now. Stan Jabalisco, W1GV, saying 73 and so long, which, in my native fist, regardless of QTH, regardless of radio type, regardless of bands operated, has always translated into da-da-da-da-da-da.